The last lecture dealt with the path to war and ultimately how Charles I blundered into a conflict with his parliament. This lecture will set out to explain the cause of the First and Second Civil War and why in 1649 the outcome was the unprecedented decision to execute the king. Over this lecture, the intention is to explain why by 1649 both the king and parliament were unable to reach a settlement and return Britain to stable government. Knowledge-wise, you will be able to explain the events and actions of 1642 to 1649. Skills-wise, you will analyse the actions of Charles as a cause of political instability. Then finally, behaviourally, you will evaluate all the causes for the failure to reach settlement and suggest the most significant reason for this failure. The First Civil War fell into three main phases. To help visualise the events of the First Civil War and reach a judgment as to why Parliament won, let us use a power balance chart. On the x-axis is the years of the First Civil War. On the y-axis is a rating of power between 1 and 5 for both the King and Parliament. 0 is neutral, the power is equal between them. The first phase of the Civil War in 1642 and 1643 saw the advantage lay with the King. The King controlled much of the country and benefited from the support of the majority of gentry and nobility. Aided by his experienced nephews, Prince Rupert and Maurice. Even so, at the Battle of Edgehill in Warwickshire on the 23rd of October 1642, the outcome was indecisive for either side. The second phase begins in 1643. Pym had used the position of London to Parliament's advantage by establishing taxes to maintain the parliamentary areas. Some in Parliament wanted to negotiate peace with the King, leaving Parliament divided over the war. After the victory for Parliament in the First Battle of Newbury in Berkshire on the 20th of September 1643, Pym was seriously ill, probably with cancer, and died. In 1644, the Solemn League and Covenant with Scotland, which Pym had persuaded Parliament to sign before his death, brings 20,000 soldiers to Parliament's side. Turning the defeat for Parliament at Copreddy Bridge in Oxfordshire on the 29th of June to a victory at Marsden Moor in Yorkshire on the 22nd of June. However, the Second Battle of Newbury in Berkshire on the 27th of October was indecisive. The third phase begins due to the poor performance of Pym's replacement, the Earl of Essex. There was a crisis between Parliament and the army. Peace talks break down, and Parliament presents a self-denying ordinance which stops all MPs from a command in a new model army, unless your name was Oliver Cromwell, who was appointed cavalry commander along with Thomas Fairfax. This new model army, created with 20,000 men, was a well-trained, disciplined and paid force. The NMA then see victory at the Battle of Naseby in Northamptonshire on the 14th of June 1645 and the Battle of Langport in Somerset on the 10th of July 1645. In April 1646, the King surrenders to the Scots in Newcastle, a settlement offer presented to the King from both Scotland and England. Scotland was willing to deal with the King because Westminster was not going to submit to their request for the Scottish Church. However, Charles delayed his response, and in February 1647 they handed the King over to the English. What is clear is that in the first phase of the war, if the King had pushed his advantage, the outcome would have been very different. Nevertheless, as a war of attrition, Parliament had the advantage. The reasons for Parliament's victory are varied and many interplay as to why ultimately Parliament won the First Civil War. Parliament had a clear set of leadership, and Pym was a force to be reckoned with. His arrangement with Scotland ensured the continued war even after his death. The Royalist leadership was based on the idea of deference and a right to rule, a misguided belief in a God-given right, ergo they will win. However, Rupert, for example, failed to consider that the rules of war had changed. At Marsden Moor, the Royalists broke ranks for dinner and the parliamentarians attacked during a thunderstorm. Parliament's hold of London gave it access to the financial markets, trade and printing presses. The new model army was Britain's first paid, trained army. it never lost a battle in the Civil War. Charles I was untrustworthy. The Scottish, when he surrendered, hoped he was to guarantee presbyteries in Scotland. However, he took too long and they handed him over to Parliament. By 1646, divisions in Parliament were present over the issues of religion. The Independents wanted a level of religious toleration, while the political Presbyterians wanted to restrict religious freedoms and bring the radical elements under control. Therefore, while the king was in Newcastle, the political Presbyterians took the upper hand and offered the Newcastle propositions. They were firstly, Parliament would nominate the key officers of state for 20 years. Secondly, Parliament would control the militia for 20 years. And thirdly, bishops would be abolished and a Presbyterian church would be created for an experimental 3 years. The king delayed. Scotland lost patience and handed the king over in February 1647. While waiting, a radical group who wanted religious toleration and a levelling of the land and voting franchise so all men could vote developed. The Levellers organised the Putney debates in 1646, supported by the army, who had not received payment. This saw Cromwell speak on their behalf, but Parliament voted to disband the new model army without pay. This decision to disband politicised the army. By June 1647, the king had not reached an agreement with Parliament, so a troop of soldiers, led by Cornet Joyce, took the king into the army's hands. By August 1647, the army presented the king with the heads of proposals drafted by Henry Ireton, which was the army's basis of a fair settlement with the king. It was a softer offer than the Newcastle propositions. Instead of triennial parliaments, there would be biennial parliaments. Rather than 20 years, Parliament would nominate key officers for 10 years. It would only control the army for 10 years. And rather than banning bishops, there would be a limit to their power. This was a much fairer offer to Charles. However, Charles was aware of the divisions within the army between the radical and the moderate elements. Like his other enemy, Parliament, who were also divided, so was the army. Surely a sit-and-wait strategy was all that was needed. To confuse the issue even more, the Leveller elements, led by Rainsborough in the army, offered the king the agreement of the people, requesting religious toleration and annual parliaments elected by all adult males. This suggestion was countered by Henry Ireton. Ireton claimed all voters must have a property qualification to vote. Cromwell tried to stop each side descending into conflict. The debates and disagreements ended when Charles managed to escape to Hampton Court. He was recaptured and sent to Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. The army was divided on what to do with Charles. By December 1647, a settlement still had not been reached. Some London Levellers, given out copies of the agreement of the people, called on an army mutiny. Cromwell rode out and quickly returned order and punished their leaders. On the 26th of December 1647, the king signed a secret engagement with the Scots to guarantee a Presbyterian church in Scotland and one in England for 3 years in return for military assistance to regain his crown. Parliament in January voted for no more negotiations with Charles. The army ready to fight, and the Second Civil War began. The Scots entered England in April 1648, and random rebellions broke out around England. They were all defeated by August, ending the Second Civil War. Between August and November, Parliament was unable to decide whether to negotiate with the king. The king had refused directly to abolish bishops for more than 3 years, remembering James I's statement that no bishops meant no king. The army were more unified on the course of action. At a prayer meeting in Windsor during the Second Civil War, Colonel Harrison had labelled Charles as a man of blood using biblical scripture. Henry Ireton delivered his remonstrance of the army to Parliament, calling for Charles to be brought to justice in November 1648. In December, because Parliament were unable to reach a decision, Colonel Pride purged Parliament of those who were active in promoting further discussions with the king. The purge excluded 186 MPs who wanted to negotiate, and a further 45 were arrested who were active in promoting discussions. This rump parliament consisted of 240 MPs who agreed to place the king on trial, and a further 71 who became actively involved in the trial and execution of Charles I. The king was found guilty on the 27th of January 1649 and was executed to a stunned crowd on the 30th of January 1649. Over this lecture, I have attempted to explain why by 1649 both the king and parliament were unable to reach a settlement and return Britain to stable government. Knowledge-wise, you need to be able to explain the events and actions of 1642 to 1649. Skills-wise, you will analyse the actions of Charles as a cause of political instability in the associated material. Then finally, behaviourally, you will evaluate all the causes for the failure to reach settlement and suggest the most significant reason for this failure. Please now complete the associated material.